In March of 1974, a Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle on Lubang Island in the Philippines and formally surrendered his sword. This alone wasn't unusual for the era, except for one detail that stunned the world watching the news coverage. World War II had ended 29 years earlier. Onoda had spent nearly 3 decades hiding in the jungle, still fighting a war that, for the rest of the planet, had been over since 1945. Onoda had been sent to Lubang Island in late 1944 as an intelligence officer, with direct orders from his superior officer that he was never to surrender and never to take his own life, regardless of what happened, and that he was to continue guerrilla resistance operations until officially relieved of duty by a superior officer in person. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, word reached most soldiers stationed across the Pacific relatively quickly. Onoda and a small group of fellow soldiers hiding with him did receive leaflets announcing the surrender, dropped by air over the following months and years. But Onoda, trained specifically in intelligence and psychological warfare himself, became convinced the leaflets were Allied propaganda, a trick designed to lure Japanese holdouts out of hiding so they could be captured or killed. The specific direct order he had received to never surrender until relieved by a superior officer in person gave him a rigid framework that made it psychologically possible to dismiss any and all evidence the war had ended, since technically no one had relieved him of that order. For years, Onoda and his remaining companions survived in the jungle, living off stolen rice, bananas, and coconuts from local farms, occasionally engaging in skirmishes with Filipino police and local residents whom he continued to view as wartime enemies or enemy collaborators. Over the following decades, his companions were killed one by one, some in confrontations with local authorities, others from illness, until Onoda was entirely alone, still following orders from a war that had ended before some of the people now hunting him had even been born. Japanese authorities made multiple attempts over the years to locate and retrieve him, including sending family members to broadcast messages into the jungle and dropping newspapers and photographs intended to prove the war had ended. Onoda later explained that he interpreted every one of these attempts as increasingly sophisticated enemy propaganda, reasoning that if the war had truly ended, his direct superior officer would have personally come to relieve him of his orders, and until that exact condition was met, nothing else could convince him otherwise. The situation was finally resolved in 1974, when a Japanese adventurer, deliberately searching for Onoda after becoming fascinated by his story, found him in the jungle and spent time earning his trust. Onoda still refused to surrender to the young man directly, insisting that only his original commanding officer could issue that order. Remarkably, Japanese authorities were able to locate Onoda's former commander, by then an elderly former bookstore clerk who had left military life decades earlier, and flew him to the Philippines specifically to formally relieve Onoda of his orders in person. Only then, faced with the one specific condition he had held on to for 29 years, did Onoda finally lay down his sword, rifle, and ammunition and accept that the war was over. What makes his story remarkable isn't simply the length of time he survived alone in hostile jungle terrain, though that alone is extraordinary, but the sheer psychological discipline required to maintain complete conviction in a mission for nearly 3 decades, actively rejecting overwhelming evidence to the contrary based entirely on a rigid technical interpretation of a single order given by a man he hadn't seen in almost 30 years. Upon his return to Japan, Onoda found himself something of a national curiosity, a living link to a war most of the country had spent decades trying to move past, and he reportedly struggled to adjust to a modern Japan that had transformed almost entirely since he'd last seen it, eventually relocating to Brazil for a period to work as a cattle rancher, before later returning to Japan, where he became involved in youth education programs focused on wilderness survival. Onoda wasn't entirely alone in this phenomenon. Other Japanese holdouts were discovered in the decades following the war's end, scattered across various Pacific islands, some surrendering only when directly confronted with undeniable proof, others living in complete isolation for years based on similar convictions that surrender leaflets and newspapers were elaborate deceptions. But Onoda's case remains the most extensively documented and most extraordinary, both for the sheer length of time involved and for the specific, almost bureaucratic condition, a superior officer's direct order, that kept him fighting a war the rest of the world had already resolved, mourned, rebuilt from, and moved past almost 3 decades earlier. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014, having lived long enough to watch the world transform not once, but twice. First through the war he refused to believe had ended, and then through the decades of change that followed his eventual return. A man whose extraordinary discipline and unwavering belief in an order kept him fighting alone in a jungle for longer than most modern wars have lasted in their entirety. If stories like this, where individual conviction collided with history in ways almost impossible to believe, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to the grave details, because history holds far more stories like this than most people will ever know.